September 14, 1982. At 6 a.m., the shutters of the Prince's Palace above Monaco harbor remained closed. Below, the Mediterranean moved without interruption. Fishing boats traced familiar lines across water that had reflected the Grimaldi residence for more than 7 centuries. The limestone façade, pale and severe, faced the sea as it always had, unchanged by the night before. Inside, telephones rang in corridors designed for ceremony. Footsteps crossed marble floors that had carried ambassadors, film stars, naval officers. A flag hung at half-mast from a tower first fortified in the 13th century. The palace did not tremble. It did not speak. It absorbed. Less than 12 hours earlier, a car had left the winding mountain road above the principality. One life ended. Another survived. The palace, perched on its rock, received the news as it had received wars, treaties, marriages, and births. Its walls held the shock in silence. For centuries, this residence was engineered to project continuity. Thick ramparts. Guarded gates. Balconies positioned precisely above the square, so that a ruling family could be seen but never reached. It was built to suggest that nothing inside it could fracture beyond repair. Yet within its rooms lived a child who would grow into a symbol of rupture. The contradiction was architectural before it was personal. A fortress intended to stabilize a dynasty would become the setting for its most public vulnerability. A residence meant to frame fairy tales would witness their collapse. The palace promised endurance, the lives within it moved according to accident, grief, and private resistance. Stone implies permanence. Blood does not. The palace remains fixed on its cliff, older than the nation it crowns. But what happens when a structure built to preserve an image must contain a family unable to remain within it? When survival itself becomes a form of defiance, can walls designed for legacy still control the story unfolding inside them? Long before cameras gathered in the palace square, before the marriage that altered Monaco's image, before tragedy defined a generation, the Rock of Monaco was primarily a military calculation. In 1297, a small fortress overlooking a narrow strip of Mediterranean coastline changed hands through deception. A member of the Grimaldi family, dressed as a Franciscan monk, gained entry and seized control. The episode later became legend, but at the time it was simply strategy. The fortress was not yet a palace. It was a defensive outpost, stone walls positioned to command a harbor that could be both refuge and vulnerability. For centuries, Monaco existed in tension. Too small to dominate, too valuable to ignore. France pressed from the west. Genoa from the sea. Spain and Savoy shifted influence across the region. The structure on the rock expanded not out of aesthetic ambition but out of necessity. Towers thickened. Courtyards closed inward. Windows narrowed. The residence that would one day host royalty, film stars, and heads of state began as a place designed to survive siege. By the 19th century, Monaco's relevance seemed uncertain. The principality had lost territory. Revenue declined. Its population was measured in thousands, not millions. The palace itself was functional but modest compared to the grand courts of Europe. Versailles had 2,300 rooms. Schönbrunn stretched across acres of landscaped symmetry. Monaco's palace remained compact, its courtyards intimate, its influence regional. It was not yet a global stage. In 1863, a different form of architecture altered Monaco's trajectory, the casino at Monte Carlo. Gambling revenues began to replace lost land as the principality's economic foundation. Wealth arrived not through conquest but through leisure. The palace, perched above this transformation, acquired a new role. It no longer guarded borders alone. It presided over spectacle. Still, its international visibility remained limited. European aristocracy visited, newspapers occasionally mentioned the Grimaldi name. But Monaco was not a center of cultural gravity. It was an enclave, elegant, discreet, strategically quiet. By the mid-20th century, Prince Rainier III inherited both the palace and its limitations. The building had endured wars and occupations. During the Second World War, Monaco's neutrality proved fragile. Italian and later German forces occupied the principality. The palace stood, but its authority narrowed under foreign control. When peace returned, so did sovereignty, but not prosperity. Rainier understood that survival required reinvention. The palace alone, however historic, could not sustain the state. Monaco's future depended on perception as much as policy. Before 1956, the palace was rarely photographed beyond Europe. Its Renaissance façade, added in the 16th century, carried faded frescoes. Its state apartments, with Italian galleries and Genoese tapestries, were impressive but not legendary. Ceremonies occurred on schedule. Guards changed posts with precision. The building maintained continuity without commanding fascination. No one expected it to become a symbol of modern fairy tale. When an American actress arrived in Monaco for the Cannes Film Festival in 1955, the palace was simply the official residence of a small Mediterranean monarchy. Its rooms had hosted diplomats, not Hollywood. Its courtyards had echoed with military bands, not flashbulbs. The meeting between Rainier III and Grace Kelly was arranged for publicity. Monaco sought exposure. The palace required renewed relevance. What followed would transform both the principality and the structure that crowned it. Yet before that transformation, the palace remained what it had always been, a calculated blend of fortress and residence. Its corridors were narrow by imperial standards. Its throne room, though ornate, was restrained compared to continental courts. The Grimaldi lineage stretched back centuries, but its power depended on delicate alliances and financial adaptation. There was no certainty in its future. When Rainier married Grace Kelly in April 1956, more than 30 million viewers watched the ceremony on television. For the first time, the palace's balconies and arcades were transmitted globally. The stone façade became backdrop to narrative. Monaco's identity shifted from strategic enclave to romantic destination. Architecture that had once guarded against invasion now framed spectacle. Within a few years, tourism expanded. Real estate values increased. The palace became both residence and brand. Its image appeared in magazines across the Atlantic. Visitors stood in the square below, looking upward at windows that suggested private elegance. 3 children were born into that structure, Caroline in 1957, Albert in 1958, and Stephanie in 1965. Each arrival reinforced continuity. Each christening echoed through rooms built centuries before microphones. Yet inside the palace, daily life remained structured and formal. Schedules dictated movement. Public and private spaces were carefully separated. State apartments were opened seasonally to visitors, family quarters remained concealed behind guarded thresholds. The building's design shaped childhood. Long corridors encouraged distance. High ceilings amplified sound. Ceremonial rooms were too vast for intimacy. The palace did not bend to accommodate modern informality. It required discipline. Stephanie grew up within walls that had witnessed dynastic survival. She was the youngest child, less burdened with direct succession but fully enclosed within expectation. The palace, by then internationally recognized, carried dual weight, heritage and image. Still, in those early years, nothing suggested fracture. Photographs from the late 1960s and 1970s show a composed family on balconies overlooking Monaco's harbor. The palace appears serene behind them, cream stone against Mediterranean blue. The structure communicates order. It implies stability. Few observers considered the tension between architecture and individual temperament. The palace was built to preserve lineage, not personality. Its scale and history demanded conformity. Its balconies required performance. Yet before tragedy altered perception, the palace's importance was still evolving. It had transformed from fortress to residence, from residence to spectacle. It stood at the center of a principality reinvented through media and finance. It mattered, but not yet in the way it would. The Rock of Monaco had endured for nearly 700 years. Its palace had adapted to political shifts and economic necessity. It had survived occupation and reinvention. What it had not yet faced was the irreversible fracture that would test whether stone could contain grief, and whether a building designed to project continuity could withstand the weight of public loss. The Prince's Palace of Monaco does not overwhelm by scale. It commands by position. Perched 60 meters above sea level on the Rock of Monaco, the structure occupies a plateau barely large enough to contain it. Unlike Versailles, which spreads across 67,000 square meters of floor space, the Monegasque Palace remains comparatively contained. Its power is vertical and strategic, not expansive. Every addition to the palace was deliberate. Renaissance galleries were layered over medieval fortifications. Frescoes were restored not to compete with Europe's great courts, but to suggest continuity with them. Italian loggias softened defensive stone. Courtyards opened inward, preserving privacy while allowing controlled spectacle. Ambition here was not about size. It was about survival through image. Rainier III understood that Monaco could not rival France militarily, nor Britain industrially. Its territory measures just over 2 square kilometers, smaller than many European estates. What it possessed instead was narrative leverage. The palace became the instrument of that leverage. The façade facing Palace Square is restrained but symmetrical. Twin staircases sweep toward a central entrance, designed for procession. Guards in crisp white uniforms mark rhythm and ceremony. Above, balconies are positioned with mathematical clarity, platforms from which the ruling family appears framed by arches, elevated yet accessible to sight. The architecture instructs behavior. From the square below, subjects and visitors look upward. Perspective reinforces hierarchy. The palace is not immense, but it is elevated. Elevation compensates for scale. Inside, the state apartments form a sequence rather than a sprawl. The Gallery of Mirrors, often compared modestly to Versailles Hall of Mirrors, reflects light through elongated proportions. Yet it is intimate by comparison. Where Versailles projects imperial excess, Monaco's gallery suggests controlled refinement. Numbers matter in contrast. Versailles required tens of thousands of laborers over decades. The Prince's Palace evolved incrementally over centuries. Its scale reflects a principality that could not afford extravagance without calculation. This restraint became ideological. When Grace Kelly entered the palace as Princess of Monaco in 1956, the architecture adapted subtly to her presence. Restoration projects accelerated. Frescoes hidden beneath plaster were uncovered. Public tours expanded during summer months. The palace became both home and exhibit. Ambition was no longer defensive. It was representational. Television altered architectural function. Balconies once reserved for local ceremonies now faced international cameras. Courtyards once enclosed against invasion became stages for cultural diplomacy. Even the throne room, lined with crimson and gold, shifted from a chamber of governance to a site of symbolic authority. Every column, every arch, became part of a carefully managed visual narrative. For Stephanie, born in 1965, the palace was not a monument to be admired. It was a constructed environment shaping daily movement. Her nursery overlooked Mediterranean light filtered through centuries-old stone. Corridors dictated distance between siblings' quarters. Private apartments remained separated from ceremonial spaces by thick doors and protocol. The building made distinctions clear: public versus private, heir versus spare, appearance versus feeling. Unlike sprawling estates in England where heirs could disappear into parkland, Monaco's palace offered limited escape. The Rock is finite. The courtyard is enclosed. From nearly every vantage point, the sea is visible, a reminder of both beauty and confinement. Ambition shaped these limits. Monaco's survival depended on clarity of identity. The palace embodied that identity. It had to appear timeless, even as the principality modernized its financial systems and cultivated global wealth. It had to suggest aristocratic depth while operating within contemporary media. Architecture became the anchor. Renier's projects reinforced this. Restoration of medieval towers emphasized lineage. Opening sections of the palace to paying visitors linked heritage with revenue. The building performed dual labor, residence and economic engine. Yet ambition inscribed tension into stone. The palace was designed to project unity. Its balconies required collective appearance. Its ceremonial halls required synchronized movement. Individual deviation could not be absorbed without visible strain. For a dynasty dependent on perception, the building's visual coherence mattered as much as governance. Stephanie grew within this structure of intention. As the youngest child, she was not expected to inherit the throne, but she was expected to embody continuity. Her presence on the balcony during national celebrations reinforced familial completeness. The architecture positioned her beside her parents and siblings in calculated symmetry. The palace did not allow asymmetry without consequence. Even leisure was spatially structured. The courtyard hosted formal receptions. The gardens below the rock provided limited reprieve. Privacy existed, but it was bounded by centuries of visibility. Ambition had created a space that was both protective and exposed. Unlike modern residences designed for psychological comfort, the palace prioritized legacy. Its ceilings rise to impress, not to soothe. Its marble floors echo footsteps, amplifying presence. Its windows frame Monaco as spectacle, not retreat. In this environment, behavior becomes performance. Renier's marriage had amplified the palace's symbolic power. Grace Kelly's cinematic past merged with dynastic continuity, elevating Monaco's global profile. The palace was no longer simply historic. It was mythologized. Ambition had succeeded. But architecture built to sustain myth carries inherent rigidity. It assumes stability of narrative. It presumes that those within it will conform to the image it projects. Stone does not adapt quickly to emotional fracture. By the late 1970s, Monaco's skyline had modernized. High-rise apartments rose along the coast. The principality expanded through land reclamation, increasing its territory incrementally. The palace, however, remained physically unchanged atop the rock, an anchor amid transformation. Its stability became symbolic contrast to the fluidity below. For Stephanie, adolescence unfolded within this tension. The palace stood as testament to centuries of calculated endurance. It implied that identity could be inherited intact. Ambition had made the building precise. But precision leaves little room for deviation. Mourning inside the prince's palace followed a pattern older than most European constitutions. At precisely scheduled hours, shutters opened to Mediterranean light. Staff moved along service corridors designed to remain invisible to visitors. The scent of polished wood and sea air mingled in long galleries where portraits of Grimaldi ancestors lined the walls. The building functioned like a disciplined organism. Each chamber had a role. Each threshold marked transition. Daily life unfolded within architecture that separated appearance from intimacy. The state apartments, throne room, blue room, Mazarine salon, were rarely used casually. Their ceilings rose too high for ordinary conversation. Their ornamentation implied ceremony even in silence. Family meals did not occur beneath frescoed vaults. Laughter did not echo comfortably across marble. Private quarters existed deeper within the structure, yet they were never entirely detached from its public function. A corridor could lead from a child's bedroom to a reception hall within minutes. A staircase might carry a princess from homework to handshake with foreign dignitaries before the hour ended. The palace compressed roles. For Stephanie, childhood was defined less by space than by surveillance of expectation. As the youngest child, she was shielded from direct succession. Her brother Albert carried the weight of continuity, her sister Caroline embodied composure. Stephanie occupied a quieter position within the hierarchy, yet the building's design ensured she was never peripheral. Balconies required symmetry. National Day appearances demanded unity. The architecture framed the family as a single composition. From the square below, citizens saw a tableau: prince, princess, heirs aligned against Renaissance arches. The distance between balcony and ground, approximately 15 meters, created elevation without detachment. Faces were visible. Expressions were studied. The palace invited scrutiny. Inside, movement followed protocol. Staff schedules structured the day. Security dictated access. Even spontaneous activity was moderated by spatial awareness. The Rock of Monaco measures less than 300 meters across at its widest point. Escape into anonymity was nearly impossible. The sea was always present. Windows facing the Mediterranean provided expansiveness without exit. The horizon suggested freedom, yet the palace remained fixed. From certain angles, yachts drifted below, symbols of mobility and private autonomy. The contrast was subtle but constant. After 1982, the architecture absorbed a different rhythm. Grace Kelly's death did not alter the palace physically. Walls remained intact. Courtyards continued to host ceremonies. Yet the interior atmosphere shifted. Absence entered rooms that had been choreographed around her presence. The throne room, where official portraits once presented a complete family, now held an incomplete image. The blue room, where formal receptions unfolded, carried an undercurrent of fragility. The palace did not acknowledge grief publicly, it maintained schedule. Architecture reinforced composure. For a 17-year-old Stephanie, survival occurred within walls that had no mechanism for emotional accommodation. The building was designed to endure siege, not trauma. Its corridors amplified silence. Its ceremonial rooms demanded restraint. Public expectation intensified. Photographers positioned themselves in Palace Square with renewed attention. Every appearance on the balcony became interpretive material. Grief was not private, it was observed through telephoto lenses. The palace facilitated this observation. Its façade provided the stage, the family supplied continuity. When Stephanie appeared beside her father during national celebrations, her position was not incidental. Architecture required alignment. The absence of her mother was visible in spatial terms, a gap where symmetry had once existed. Inside, adolescence unfolded under heightened scrutiny. The palace offered few spaces free from inherited narrative. Portraits of Grace remained on walls. Rooms retained their arrangement. The building preserved memory without adaptation. Daily routines resumed, yet the structure did not soften. As Stephanie entered early adulthood, divergence from expected behavior created spatial tension. Media attention followed her beyond the palace gates, to concerts, fashion events, relationships outside aristocratic norms. Each deviation contrasted with the palace's rigid façade. The architecture responded by remaining unchanged. This immobility magnified contrast. When Stephanie pursued music in the mid-1980s, releasing pop singles that reached European charts, the palace remained a Renaissance fortress. When she appeared in tabloids alongside bodyguards or performers, the balconies above Palace Square continued to host ceremonial waves. Two narratives unfolded in parallel, one fluid, one fixed. Within private apartments, conversations occurred about image and responsibility. The palace did not intervene directly, yet it framed every discussion. Decisions were weighed not only against personal desire but against how they would reflect upon stone centuries old. Rooms that once contained diplomatic negotiations now held familial negotiation. Power dynamics shifted subtly. Prince Rainier's authority was both paternal and architectural. As sovereign, he inhabited spaces designed for command. His daughter navigated rooms structured for continuity, not rebellion. The building influenced posture. In the throne room, chairs were arranged to reinforce hierarchy. In smaller salons, seating softened but did not dissolve formality. Even informal gatherings carried inherited gravity. The palace imposed coherence on a family experiencing divergence. Monaco beyond the rock continued to modernize. Financial institutions expanded. High-rise residences multiplied along the coast. Yet the palace resisted visual transformation. Its stone walls anchored the principality's historical legitimacy. This resistance intensified generational contrast. For Stephanie, identity formation occurred under the gaze of architecture that implied permanence. Her choices, whether artistic or personal, reverberated against stone that had survived revolutions and occupations. The building did not bend to accommodate experimentation. It endured. In time, Stephanie's presence within the palace became less frequent. Her life extended beyond its walls, into apartments, studios, and relationships detached from ceremonial rhythm. Yet the palace remained reference point. Each return for official events reinstated alignment beneath arches. Architecture does not forget. The palace had shaped centuries of Grimaldi behavior through confinement and elevation. It had reinforced unity through spatial design. It had absorbed grief without alteration. But buildings designed for continuity face a limit when continuity itself fractures. Stone can frame a family. It cannot guarantee that the family will remain framed. September 13, 1982 began as an ordinary descent. The road from Roc Agel, the Grimaldi family's country residence in the hills above Monaco, curves along steep inclines carved into limestone. Guardrails trace the edge between mountain and void. The distance to the principality below is measured in minutes. That afternoon, a Rover 3500 left the roadway. The car struck a retaining wall, then tumbled down the slope. Princess Grace sustained catastrophic injuries and died the following evening. Stephanie, seated in the vehicle, survived. The palace did not witness the accident. It received its consequence. Within hours, the Rock of Monaco transformed from residence to epicenter of global attention. News agencies gathered in Palace Square. Satellite trucks positioned themselves below Renaissance arches. The façade that had framed fairy tale imagery now framed loss. Architecture absorbed crisis without alteration. Inside, the throne room became a site of condolence. Black drapery softened crimson walls. Flags lowered. Footsteps multiplied along corridors designed for procession. The palace's ceremonial chambers, once instruments of celebration, were reoriented toward mourning. The breaking point was not merely personal. It was structural. Grace Kelly had functioned as a bridge between Monaco's medieval lineage and 20th-century media culture. Her presence stabilized the palace's modern narrative. Without her, the architecture remained intact but its symbolic balance shifted. For Prince Rainier, sovereignty continued. State duties did not pause. The palace required visibility. Appearances on the balcony resumed, though diminished in warmth. The building demanded continuity even as private grief intensified. For Stephanie, the event introduced permanence of a different kind. Survival within a dynasty shaped by spectacle carried implication. She had been present at the moment that ended her mother's life. Public speculation followed. Questions circulated in press accounts, about control of the vehicle, about memory, about trauma. The palace did not respond to rumor. It stood silent. Silence, however, does not neutralize scrutiny. In the months following the funeral, the palace resumed ceremony. National Day unfolded as scheduled. The guard changed at appointed hours. Tourists continued to pass through state apartments during summer. Revenue and ritual persisted. Yet the building's internal equilibrium had shifted. Where Grace had once occupied a defined spatial role, balcony center, formal portrait alignment, diplomatic reception hostess, there was now absence. Architecture revealed this gap through symmetry disrupted. Family compositions required adjustment. Photographs showed slight asymmetry beneath arches. The palace maintained image, but tension accumulated beneath it. Stephanie's adulthood unfolded under intensified media focus. Her movements beyond the palace were tracked with particular interest. Relationships that might have remained private elsewhere acquired amplified significance against the backdrop of dynastic expectation. In 1991, she began a relationship with her former bodyguard, Daniel de Cruet. The contrast between palace hierarchy and personal choice was visible. A sovereign's daughter, raised within fortified walls, aligned herself with someone positioned professionally to guard those walls. The marriage in 1995 formalized this divergence. It occurred in Monaco, but not within the ceremonial grandeur historically associated with princely unions. The palace did not expand to celebrate it. Its façade remained unchanged. The union dissolved in 1996 amid public scandal. Photographs circulated globally. The palace did not comment extensively. It continued to host state events. Stone resisted narrative volatility. Each rupture reinforced the central fracture initiated in 1982. Prince Rainier's authority endured, yet his health declined in the early 2000s. The palace once again became a site of medical concern and controlled information. In April 2005, Rainier III died. The succession transferred to Prince Albert II. Another transition occurred within rooms built for dynastic continuity. With Rainier's death, the palace completed a generational shift. The children who had once stood beneath balconies as heirs now embodied governance and legacy. For Stephanie, this shift formalized distance from central authority. Her role was peripheral yet symbolic. The breaking point, however, remained anchored to that mountain road. The accident had introduced irreversibility. Before it, the palace's narrative balanced heritage with modern enchantment. After it, vulnerability became permanent subtext. No restoration project could recover original symmetry. No public ceremony could erase memory embedded in corridor and portrait. Architecture built to project endurance encountered an event it could not integrate seamlessly. Monaco's economy continued to expand. The principality reclaimed land from the sea, increasing territory by measurable percentages. Luxury towers rose higher than the palace itself. Yet the rock remained focal point. Its palace preserved authority through continuity. But continuity no longer implied innocence. Stephanie's later years reflected adaptation rather than alignment. Philanthropic work, particularly in HIV/AIDS advocacy, shifted public perception. Her life extended beyond youthful rebellion and scandal into structured engagement. Yet the palace remained reference frame, an origin impossible to abandon entirely. The breaking point had redefined that origin. Stone does not fracture easily. It weathers storms, occupation, political shifts. Yet architecture dependent on image can be altered by a single afternoon beyond its walls. The prince's palace endured. Its narrative did not remain intact. The prince's palace did not decline after 1982. It adjusted. Unlike abandoned estates that crumble through neglect, the palace on the rock retained state funding, ceremonial function, and sovereign occupancy. Its limestone walls were cleaned. Frescoes were restored. Courtyards were maintained with precision. From an architectural standpoint, it remained intact. Yet purpose is not preserved through maintenance alone. Before the accident, the palace embodied a narrative of continuity strengthened by modern romance. Afterward, its role shifted toward institutional stability. Emotion receded, protocol advanced. The building's identity narrowed to sovereignty rather than story. This was mutation rather than decay. Under Prince Albert II, who ascended in 2005, the palace reinforced its constitutional function. Environmental initiatives, diplomatic engagements, and financial governance defined Monaco's international posture. The structure atop the rock became less fairy tale residence and more administrative symbol. Balcony appearances continued, but their tone altered. Celebrations were measured. Spectacle softened. The architecture remained photogenic, yet it no longer carried cinematic myth with the same intensity. Tourists still entered the state apartments during summer months. They moved through the Italian gallery, examined 17th-century tapestries, stood briefly in the throne room. Guides described lineage dating back to 1297. The palace functioned as curated memory. Curated memory differs from lived mythology. For Stephanie, the palace's mutation mirrored her own. Her presence within official events became selective. She engaged in philanthropic initiatives, particularly through associations addressing HIV/AIDS, causes that required direct contact with communities far removed from palace ceremony. These commitments unfolded largely beyond the rock. The contrast between architecture and activity grew clearer. The palace symbolized hereditary authority. Her work often rejected distance, emphasizing proximity and human contact. Where the palace elevated, advocacy descended into lived realities. The building remained constant. The meaning attached to her life diverged from it. Ownership of the palace did not change hands, the Grimaldi lineage persisted. Yet psychological ownership shifted. For Stephanie, the structure became origin rather than destination. It was backdrop to formative events, not center of ongoing identity. Architecture had outlived its original emotional alignment. Meanwhile, Monaco itself transformed physically. Land reclamation projects expanded the principality's territory by measurable increments, approximately 20% since the mid-20th century. New districts rose from engineered coastline. Glass towers reflected Mediterranean light in sharp vertical lines. From certain angles, modern high-rises now rival the palace in height. The rock remains elevated, but the skyline competes visually. This introduces subtle betrayal. The palace was built to dominate its surroundings. In medieval centuries, no structure challenged its position. In the 21st century, luxury apartments, private rather than dynastic, approach comparable elevation. Wealth disperses vertically along the coast, no longer centralized atop the rock. Authority becomes symbolic rather than spatial. Yet the palace persists as Monaco's official residence. State ceremonies continue within its courtyards. National Day still gathers citizens in Palace Square. The guard's uniform remains white and precise against cream stone. The building has not surrendered relevance. What has changed is its narrative weight. For decades, the palace carried dual roles, fortress of sovereignty and theater of enchantment. After 1982, enchantment diminished. After 2005, governance intensified. The structure's emotional register cooled. Stephanie's life followed a similar arc. Early rebellion contrasted with architectural rigidity. Later engagement reflected measured autonomy. She did not retreat entirely from royal association, but she did not center herself within palace ritual either. This selective proximity redefined the building's influence. Where once the palace shaped childhood movement and public identity daily, it now functions as periodic frame. Appearances on balconies during national events remain choreographed. Photographs still capture alignment beneath arches. But these moments no longer define the totality of her life. The palace survives as monument. Monuments preserve image, they do not guarantee emotional resonance. Within its walls, restoration projects have uncovered additional Renaissance frescoes hidden beneath later plaster. Conservation specialists stabilize pigments centuries old. The palace invests in its past, ensuring visual continuity. Yet continuity of stone differs from continuity of narrative. The building has outlived the generation that transformed it into global symbol. Grace Kelly's presence remains embedded in portraits and archival footage shown to visitors. Rainier's authority persists in documented reform. Stephanie's adolescence remains linked to its balconies. But none of these lives unfold there with former intensity. The palace stands occupied yet partially historical, a living museum of governance layered atop medieval defense. Its mutation is subtle, from romantic stage to administrative anchor, from fairy tale residence to curated heritage. It did not betray its purpose through collapse. It fulfilled it too well. By preserving image across centuries, it required individuals within it to conform or separate. Those who could not remain aligned adjusted their proximity. Stone remained sovereign. Lives adapted around it. Late afternoon settles differently on the rock of Monaco. By 5:30 p.m., the palace square begins to thin. Tour groups descend toward the harbor. The last visitors exit the state apartments. Guards remain at their posts, white uniforms distinct against stone that has endured for more than 7 centuries. From the courtyard, the Mediterranean reflects muted light. The façade, Renaissance arches layered over medieval fortification, casts long shadows across flagstones worn smooth by procession. Windows close one by one. Shutters fold inward. Inside, corridors return to measured quiet. The throne room stands intact, crimson walls, gilded chairs, ceremonial order undisturbed. The gallery of mirrors reflects empty space rather than diplomatic reception. Portraits of ancestors observe from fixed positions, their expressions unchanged by decades of transition. The palace does not display grief. It does not display rebellion. It does not display adaptation. It contains. Beyond its walls, Monaco continues to expand into the sea. Towers rise. Yachts move. Financial markets fluctuate. Generations age. Lives diverge from expectation and return only briefly for ceremony. The palace remains elevated above it all, 60 meters of limestone and lineage overlooking a coastline that no longer depends solely upon it. Balconies wait for appearance. Courtyards wait for procession. Rooms wait for occupancy. Stone persists without commentary. What does a building remember when the narratives that once animated it soften into archival record? And when those who once stood upon its balconies no longer require its elevation, does the palace preserve them, or simply outlast them?